Welcome back to the Not Just a Pony Ride podcast. This is the show where you can learn everything about EAS that you would ever want to know. And today I have our program director, Shelby Schultz, on. Welcome, Shelby.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having me.
We are going to dive in today to a topic that I don't think a lot of people maybe think super critically about, but it is something that's really important, especially if your centers are offering therapy services or any kind of like medical treatment, and that is confidentiality. So why is confidentiality important? Why should we worry about it?
I think confidentiality is important in a lot of places in our life, but especially in the industry that we're in, because we do have privileged access to a lot of people's private medical information. A lot of the people that are coming to our centers for services are coming for perhaps therapy services, which is medical treatment protected by HIPAA. But they may also be coming for adapted writing or therapeutic writing or EAL, but also still have a diagnosis and would expect that information be kept confidential and private, and handled with delicacy by the staff that understands it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when participants come into our center to seek services, we are asking for medical release, from a physician or some kind of background paperwork so that we know what kind of disability or what kind of limitations our participants might have, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we store that, we use a system called Salesforce. So we house all of our information in there via, in our patient files and that kind of a thing. But when staff come on at HETRA, we ask them all to sign confidentiality notice and HIPAA notice so that they know what the limitations are, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So it is our job as instructors and therapists to protect that information. So I have a couple of questions. One, how is that information being stored within your system, and is it password protected, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we talk a little bit about the importance of kind of that password or what that barrier does for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So our system, we do have a pretty robust system. I'm going to put a shameless plug out to Equiforce, who helps us with all of our Salesforce and is a podcast sponsor.
Thank goodness for them.
But our system is pretty robust, but it doesn't have to be quite so complicated. But we do have a lot of safeguards in place where different levels of staff have access to different types of information within our system. So our adaptive writing instructors have access to information on participants within the adapted writing program, but don't have access to information on participants in the therapy program.
Mm-hmm.
Our therapists have access to participants in the therapy program or participants in the adapted writing program that they may be consulting on, and so on and so forth. And as we continue up, we do have a mental health program, and those records are also protected separately from the other types of records within our Salesforce system.
Mm-hmm.
And then we do use another system called JotForm that helps us, and it is HIPAA compliant. Everything's password protected on there, and the information is only able to be seen by people who have the right
qualifications.
Yeah,
or
qualifications to see those.
The people who need to see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Keeping everybody on a need to know basis, right? And it's especially important if you have any kind of mental health services happening at your center that is conducted by a mental health practitioner, because they have a whole nother set of rules that are much more stringent even than like OTPT or speech medical records are. And that is, can have legal ramifications, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's something that we need to take pretty seriously. So aside from thinking critically about who has access to those medical records or that sensitive medical information within your documentation system, whatever you choose to use, there's also other things like what we use to communicate, like via email, or if you guys have like an inter-office messenger of some kind, that sort of thing. Shelby, can you talk to us a little bit about how we manage, participant names and that kind of thing?
So big things would be making sure that you're not using participant full names, and especially not using participant full names plus diagnosis or plus information in any sort of communication that is not password protected or HIPAA compliant. So for instance, if you're sending an email, it's going to be very important that we don't send an email that says, Johnny Smith, writer at 6:00 on Thursdays. That subject line of that email may say JS Thursday participant. And then within the body of the email, we can have a little bit more detail. But that needs to be in a way that our emails are all password protected. Our email system is set up in a manner so if any of us that have our emails on our phone have to have a password on our phone in order to get into those emails on our phone, and things like that, so that somebody couldn't just come pick up our phone and get into information they shouldn't be able to. Same thing goes for any communication that's happening within your barn. So we shouldn't be walking down the hallway and saying, oh yeah, Johnny's coming in today, he has autism. That's something that should be kept confidential for Johnny's sake. We should be very cautious in the way we're using those terms. Now, there are times where we may have to clue our volunteers into some information for the safety of our participants or themselves or our horses or something like that. So for example, if we had a participant with a seizure precaution, we would want to make sure that the volunteers that are working with them that day understand that they have a seizure precaution and what would need to happen in the event of a seizure. We wouldn't need to go into extreme detail about the types of seizures that they have or what their specific diagnosis is, anything like that. Just simply, hey guys, we have a seizure precaution today. We're going to make sure we keep this hold. If something were to happen, here's the plan.
Yeah. So that's like kind of two whole bits you're talking about, right? So let's go back to really quick before we dive into like some of the volunteer things. But when we're in the barn using that kind of need to know basis, right? And that even applies to our schedule board. So
Correct.
like our schedule, we have a schedule board at Hetra that you can look at it and you can see participant name, the horse and what volunteers and TAC and all that stuff, is all on there so that everybody's on the same page. And that's a great communication tool that we utilize. However, sort of same things apply, right? So we're not using first and last name. We're using
First name only.
First name only, unless if we have two, then a last initial.
Right.
And then, but that goes even a step further for our mental health practice. So, and as mental health guidelines are given to us, it's important that information stay even more confidential. So we go as far as to do first and last initial for that. That way our horse team and everybody knows who's going to be where, when, and what areas of the barn they might be in, but then also just continues to go a step further on protecting that personal information even a bit more.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about volunteers. So you did talk about how if it's a necessary thing they need to know, then we need to share that with them, right? What do we do if I have a volunteer that is so helpful and is so sweet and says, well, what kind of diagnosis does Johnny have?
The best thing to do in that situation that I prefer is you can be honest with them. That's not information I can share with you, but thanks for coming to help Johnny today. And just be upfront with them. It's not necessarily information that they have to know. And that's the approach I generally take. I don't want to lie to them or say, I can't tell you that, things like that. But I think most people are pretty understanding and really respect that, as an organization, you're doing your due diligence to be respectful.
Keep that information safe.
Yeah.
So how do we manage, obviously our participant or our volunteers are immersed in our participant sessions because they're helping us, right? So say I have a horse handler in a mental health session and that therapist and that participant are discussing something that might be sensitive, but we have to have a horse handler in place for the activity that we're doing because we both know that anything can pop up at any time, and you can't always manage that piece of things.
Right. So it is part of we do have additional training that our volunteers have to go through in order to take part in our mental health programming because there are more delicate things and sensitive topics that can come up. And then if there ever is a really big situation that comes up, they'll have kind of a debrief post session with our mental health therapist in a safe space. If they have any questions, our mental health therapist can check in, make sure that they're not carrying really heavy baggage with them, and things like that. And part of the training for our volunteers working in our mental health program is just that. What happens if you do have a trauma dump? What happens if you get uncomfortable in a session? If the topic's too heavy, what should they do is part of that training for them.
And that's That training is is that sort of an invite only
Yeah.
kind of high level volunteer,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. So those are our volunteers. That's not a brand new volunteer that walks in the door
Yeah.
last week. Those are going to be volunteers who have been with us for a long time. They have a really good track record with us. We know they have a high level of maturity. We're not going to have teenagers in those sessions by any means.
Yeah.
Somebody that we feel like has the mental and emotional capacity to be safe in that lesson.
Yeah. And I think that's important because so many times, I mean, often even you start talking about EAL or people come out for a one-time event or a retreat or something like that. Things can come up at any time, right? So it's important that we as therapists and instructors stay within our scope with that, right? But also just kind of be prepared because as things come up, we just have to manage that the best way we can. This episode is sponsored by Stable Moments. Did you know that there are over 400,000 children in the United States foster care system? Most of these children have complex trauma needs, which makes them ideal candidates for equine-assisted learning programs. If you serve or want to serve children in foster care, Stable Moments has a plug-and-play program model utilizing community mentors and equine-assisted learning to develop life skills and heal developmental trauma. With their online certification program, you can become certified in this model and start serving kids by next season. What's even better is the program can be funded by Department of Children and Families, and the mentors are all volunteers. To learn more, head over to stablemoments.com and check out their free webinar, Healing Trauma with EAL and Mentorship. So then the other thing I think about, Shelby, is we work in a little bit of a different environment, right? So a lot of us are working in barns and arenas, and we might just kind of set up shop wherever to get our notes done or, whatever, which is awesome. That's why all of us love this job, is because it's casual and we can kind of do it, how we want to do it. But would you talk to me just a little bit about making sure our workspaces are staying confidential?
Yeah, absolutely. So a big thing for us is making sure computers are either locked or closed when we get up and walk away from our desks. So if we have an instructor or therapist that's working on notes, when they get up and they walk away from that computer either needs to be on the lock screen or it needs to be closed so that it is asleep, so that nobody can just walk into the office and get into confidential file information. Going back to what you said and having really kind of an open environment in our industry, a lot of centers use paper files for medical documents. So making sure that those files are in a place that is secure, whether that be a locking file cabinet or a safe or whatever that might be, making sure that those files aren't just left sitting out on the table in the TAC room because you have a new participant and you're running through their medical real quick to kind of get a feel for what they're going to be, and you just leave it out. That's really important that we don't do that. So anything like that, making sure that all that stuff is put away. Anything that has, and this goes for volunteers too, because our volunteers come here with the expectation that this is going to be a safe place for them to be. We do have volunteers that come here that, maybe don't have a great home environment, and they don't necessarily want everybody and their brother to know they spend every Thursday here for whatever reason that might be. So making sure that that's true for volunteers as well. Making sure that we don't have volunteer information sitting out, participant information, anything that has first name, last name, phone number, email address, home address, diagnosis, medical information, anything like that should be kept in a secure environment.
And part of that is we love our job so much, and all of our volunteers are obviously here because they want to be here, right? It's not like our volunteers get paid. They're here because they enjoy it and they mean well, right? So sometimes people, like we talked about earlier, will ask about a diagnosis or ask about a person's name or that kind of a thing. So we need to be careful with that too. If we're out in the community and, someone says, oh, I worked at Hetra, or I used to volunteer at Hetra. Does Jim Bob still ride there? Or, and they're asking about these things. How should we handle that?
Right. Another one I've heard a lot of times is, oh my gosh, we love Hetra. My neighbor comes there, Sally Smith. And even if Sally,
do you know her?
Even if Sally Smith is my participant, I should not say, oh yeah, I know Sally Smith. She comes to Hetra and she's my participant, kind of my go-to whenever I hear those kinds of things is, oh, I'm really glad to hear you've been connected with Hetra. We see a lot of people every week. I can't tell you exactly who comes or not. And just kind of in that situation, kind of swerve the question
Yeah.
a lot of times is the best. And occasionally you'll get somebody says, oh, Jim Bob, he's the older guy, he comes out and he carriage drives, and Jim Bob. And you have to say, there's a lot of people here every week.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of just leave it at that. And usually people will kind of get the gist of it, that we can't share that.
Yeah, it's important to protect that information, even kind of in casual conversation, even when people mean well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing, speaking of barn conversations or barn environments, is watching the conversations that are having. Mm-hmm. So Katie, you and I sitting here as lead therapist and program director have a lot of conversations that have confidential information in them, making sure that where we're having those conversations is safe and secure. Mm-hmm. So we're not having it in the middle of the barn aisle while we have 10 volunteers that are mingling about, or we're not having it as we're walking through the middle of the arena where somebody could overhear it, and making sure that we're being sensitive about that information.
Right. Because at the end of the day, I mean, we have a lot of people in and out of the barn, right? And so I think that that's kind of another thing to keep in mind is we love when people want to check out Hetra, and there's something about horses and like a barn. People are like, well, I was driving by, I thought I'd just swing in and like pet a horse. And we're like, oh, thank you so much for coming. We love that you have come to Hetra and that you want to check us out. But we have to keep in mind, we can't just let any old, Tom, Dick, or Harry just come into the barn to make a pass through or take an impromptu tour, because we might have medical treatment happening in our barn.
Right.
It's the same thing as if I was in a hospital or in a clinic. If I got a knee replacement and I went to the clinic, I wouldn't hope that there would just be like random people walking through my medical treatment sessions.
It's just not what happens.
It's not what happens. So if we do have people like that, we just kind of politely refer them to a public tour, because we schedule those tours at a time where it's appropriate and there's a staff member with them to address questions and to protect that confidentiality for everybody. So that's something I would recommend too.
Yeah.
Is having those assigned tour times that you can refer people to, and just being mindful that there could be therapy or, anybody doing anything in your barn at any time. So we have to be aware of that. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I do have one question. Is there any time that confidentiality should be broken, or there should be, further discussion about that?
So anytime that we have or overhear a person talking about ill intent towards themselves, so suicidal ideation or thoughts or concerns, or towards somebody else. Okay. Those are two times that confidentiality may be broken. And that goes for both our participants and our volunteers. And you would have to go through whatever your center and your state policies and laws are.
Mm-hmm. And therapists in general are mandatory reporters. So we do have to, if we hear of that information, it is required that we report it for our licensure, and that could come with some legal follow-up. Yeah. So they might then request, some documentation about this, or they might request some other things like that. So that's why it's important that we maintain those confidential things and we do our diligent kind of documentation and making sure that we do all those things, but also educating yourself about the laws in your state and within the occupations that you employ. Correct. So as program director, Shelby makes sure that we have all the things in line, because we do have mental health providers and we do have, OT, PT, speech. It might look a little different if you only have adaptive writing instructors, right? So just kind of looking at the positions that you have and what that, legal requirement for confidentiality might be.
So in the state of Nebraska, everybody is considered a mandatory reporter. So one of the things that we have done with our staff is require all of our staff members to go through a mandatory reporter training annually. We work with Project Harmony, who is another local nonprofit, and they provide trainings on mandatory reporter, like what you need to do and what are the proper processes for our state.
How to handle it.
Yeah, things to know from a legal standpoint, and also things to know from a personal care standpoint, if you come across a situation where you do have to report.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's cognizant to do for your employees that may encounter something like that, right? So we do require our staff to obviously sign HIPAA and do the confidentiality thing, right? Do we make our volunteers do anything?
Yeah. So when our volunteers come on in their new volunteer paperwork, which is updated annually, there is a confidentiality statement in there that just says they agree that things they hear here may be confidential information. They understand that they need to keep that private, and so they do sign that.
Okay, cool. And we kind of have some wording that we use, obviously, that they sign within our volunteer paperwork.
Correct.
So I will share the wording that we use for our volunteer handbook that kind of says, yes, I agree to do all these things and to keep those things safe. So at minimum, if you don't have your volunteers sign something that says that they will keep confidentiality, that's a really good idea to do and to educate everybody about. So if you are a member at Patreon, our exclusive educational club, I'm going to share that over there for all of our subscribers. I'll link that in the show notes below if you want to learn more about it and if you want to get access to that info. All right. Well, thank you for sitting down with me today, Shelby. This is I know some people are probably thinking wah, wah. It's not a super fun topic, but it's really important. And I think it's something that a lot of centers should take very seriously because it can have legal ramifications.
Absolutely. I think especially in the work that we do, there could be a time where you hear something that, like we said, may need to be reported on. So I think making sure that you are updated on what those scenarios might be and what is appropriate in which situation is really important.
Absolutely. If anybody has any questions about confidentiality within their own centers or would like help maybe reviewing what their center's policies are or kind of revamping those, reach out to us and let us know. I will put a link in the show notes. You can put your info in there and we're happy to touch base with you and help you in whatever way we can.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. That's all for today. But until the next episode launches, scroll down to the show notes and click on the link to get plugged in with us on Facebook, Instagram, or our exclusive educational club at Patreon. This podcast is presented by Hetra University, the educational arm of Heartland Equine Therapeutic Riding Academy in Gretna, Nebraska. Hetra University's mission is to provide high-quality educational offerings to the EAS community. Check out all the Hetra University has to offer at www.hetrauniversity.org.